Hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining our webinar, Small Grants, Tips for Success for Grantors and Grantees. As Adrienne mentioned, my name is Laura Zilmer and I work at Save the Children on the TOPS program. So I formerly served as the coordinator for TOPS' Small Grants program, which some of you might be familiar with. And I'm happy to be joined today by Clara Doctors von Leeuwen from Action Against Hunger, and also Beth Outerson from Medical Teams International. So both Clara and Beth are with organizations that formerly received small grants during the most recent phase of TOPS' Small Grants program. And they'll be elaborating upon their experiences a bit today during our webinar. So our webinar today is designed for both organizations interested in implementing their own small grants program, as well as organizations that might be looking to apply for and manage a small grant. So a quick overview. In this webinar, we will talk about what a small grant is and what types of organizations might consider a small grants program in the first place. We'll then discuss considerations and tips for starting up a small grants program. Clara will lead us in a conversation about how to position your organization for and apply for a small grant. And we will go over then how to manage a small grants program generally after applicants have been selected for grants. And Beth will speak from the grantee perspective on how to implement a small grant once awarded. So if time permits, at the end we'll have a Q&A period and also review the poll questions from the beginning, which we will answer throughout the webinar. And as we go, feel free to type any questions or comments in the chat box that we've been using, and we can revisit your comments throughout or at the end as appropriate. So some of you might be wondering, what even is a small grant? And that's a very reasonable question. It seems like a straightforward question on the surface, but there really is no hard and fast definition of what a small grant is. So depending on the program, a small grant could range anywhere from a few $100s to several $100,000. If your organization is relatively small, like a small foundation, for example, a few $1,000s might be a significant amount of money, whereas a larger international NGO might find the same grant amount not worth pursuing. So the TOPS program had two different types of small grants. We called them micro grants and program improvement awards. These grants had ceilings of $50,000 and $100,000 respectively. They had slightly different purposes, and the process for awarding and managing these grant types also differed slightly. So as a general rule of thumb, the larger the grants, the more due diligence might be required. And that was the case for our $100,000 grants. So what kinds of organizations might consider creating a small grants program? I can identify kind of three distinct groups that might be interested in setting up and running a small grants program. So the first is an organization or a foundation that wants to further their mission through other implementing partners who are perhaps better suited to carry out particular work. Another group might be those implementing under a larger award. So under the TOPS program, a small grants program was written into USAID's original request for applications, with the purpose of this being to offer current and potential Food for Peace partners opportunities to improve their programming through small grants. Finally, a third group might be organizations with undesignated funds interested in building their own capacity by awarding grants within their organization. So an example of this is Save the Children's Innovating for Impact program that seeks to promote innovation within our own organization by pioneering new approaches in our programs, in our operations, and also our fundraising. So for all of these groups, small grants can be a way to further your mission and increase your reach. Aside from these benefits, small grants are valuable for a number of reasons. So to find out what organizations found most beneficial about small grants as a funding mechanism compared to other types of funding mechanisms, We surveyed former top small grants program recipients, asking them what they valued most about the top small grants program. So respondents answered that the aspect they valued most was the encouragement of innovation and creativity. Because of their small size, small grants kind of provide this unique opportunity to promote innovation. So whereas donors might be less likely to invest in something risky or untested with a large grant, small grants are the smaller investment, so grantors might be more willing to fund an idea or a practice in a relatively underexplored area. Those surveyed also answered that they appreciated the ability to build on an existing project. And for those of you who have implemented a grant previously, you might be able to understand that it's not uncommon that you might run through funds more quickly than anticipated, and then at the end you don't have the resources available to kind of go that last final mile, like sharing results from your project, for example. So for Clara, who is one of my co-presenters with Action Against Hunger, the small grant that was awarded to their organization allowed them to thoroughly analyze data and disseminate results from a research project that they had previously conducted with a separate pool of funding. And then in addition to that, other respondents answered that they valued the small grants program in that it provided them access to technical support. Other answers included the ease of the application process, the ability to fund a one-off purchase or event, the ability to propose a risky idea, the flexibility permitted while implementing, and also the ability to receive funds relatively quickly. So while these might be things that all grant makers of different grant sizes strive for in their grants program, I would say that an effective small grants program in particular allows for these types of practices, maybe more so than other sources of funding. So the first step when setting up a small grants program as a grantor is establishing a clear focus. So you should think about exactly what it is that you want to achieve through the program. Do you want your focus to be fairly broad or really specific? So with the top small grants program, the focus was somewhat broad in that we accepted applications for several technical areas, including nutrition, agriculture and natural resource management, social and behavioral change, WASH, and other technical areas as well. So while this general focus allowed us to support projects across a wide variety of sectors, having a bit of a more specific topic-focused RFA could have been beneficial in ensuring a particular pre-identified gap would be filled. So there were a couple instances where TAPS did request specific proposals. One of these was the development of a warehouse desk safety guide. And this actually ended up being one of the most used products resulting from the TAPS small grant. So TAPS has, we have the FSN network has a resource library, and this is one of the most downloaded products, suggesting perhaps that a more targeted request for applications might have benefited the implementing community. So at any rate, the first step in setting up such a program should be defining what it is you want to accomplish. And then once you've determined this, the next step would be soliciting applications. So your organization should write a request for applications that's really quite clear and concise, and the clearer the better, really. So toward the top of the document, you might list important dates like when the initial concept note is due or when a full application should be submitted. So you can see on the right here the cover page that TAPS used for one of their RFAs. It should also be obvious from a quick glance where to submit any applications and should there be questions, who can be contacted. The RFA should clearly state also the objective of the small grant program, what the grant ceiling is, expected duration of the grant implementation, the types of entities eligible or encouraged to apply, and then if you want to maybe further illustrate the types of projects your organization seeks to fund, you might consider briefly listing a couple examples of those kinds of activities. And here on the right we have this screenshot of our contents page that we used for the RFA. So you can see all of the different types of information that was provided. And I would argue that this even could have been condensed a little bit. So your RFA will look different depending on the type of program and also perhaps the size of the grant. As I mentioned, larger grants might require more information and more due diligence. Also important to think about what types of expenses you're not willing to fund. So a more personal example, I helped manage an emergency grants program in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. So it was only after really we had collected and begun evaluating proposals that we decided that we weren't interested in funding certain things like electronics, so iPads and laptops. And making this decision from the very start and then clearly stating this restriction in our request for applications would have really streamlined the process quite a bit and eliminated some of the back and forth that was then required to clarify with applicants that this needed to be removed from the budget and it wasn't an allowable expense. So as a rule of thumb, it's difficult to overemphasize how important it is to be as straightforward as possible. And doing this can save both you and the applicant quite a bit of time. If you're drafting your request for applications, your organization should also develop evaluation criteria that supports your grant program's objectives and also your organization's philosophies, sort of, on how these objectives will be delivered. So the evaluation criteria should be developed before you begin collecting applications, and it's the same criteria that really should be applied to all applications to ensure that each is reviewed fairly and objectively. So depending on the purpose of the grant program, evaluation criteria will vary. But generally speaking, it might include things like whether the organization has a clear mission aligned with the objective of the program, whether the organization has demonstrated that they can carry out the type of work that they're proposing in their application, and whether the project has a strong likelihood of making a positive difference. It can also be beneficial to set targets about the types of projects or the types of organizations you seek to fund. So for grant makers funding activities outside their own organization, one target might be thinking about the size of organizations you want to fund. And small grants can be really a unique opportunity to, as I mentioned, explore some more risky ideas, which might mean funding organizations that you're less familiar with or smaller and more locally based. So while the Top Small Grants program request for applications encouraged field-driven and field-led projects, it was oftentimes larger U.S.-based organizations that were awarded the significant majority, I would say, of our grants. And this wasn't always the case, and also to some extent this makes sense as U.S.-based organizations are most familiar with Food for Peace and TOPS, our requirements, and our happenings. But setting targets from the start to reach maybe a more diverse mix of recipients is something that we perhaps could have benefited from exploring further. Anyway, once this criteria and targets are established, you can include this information in your solicitation for applications. Communicating this criteria clearly can help limit irrelevant applications and encourage the submission of high-quality proposals. So being transparent in this way will benefit your organization and also organizations considering applying by helping them understand their likelihood of success. In addition to the RFA itself, you'll want to develop any templates that will be required for completion by applicants. This might include a budget template, like the one shown here on the bottom right, and other types of relevant materials. And then once this is complete, you can distribute it either publicly, you can look into posting it or sending it through relevant listservs or trusted networks, depending really on how targeted you want to be in your distribution. Another important consideration is thinking about the human resources that will be required, both in terms of evaluating proposals and to support the grant program once it's more fully up and running. So as best as you can, try to estimate the number of applications you expect to receive, and then from there you can kind of plan accordingly. So In my experience, reviewing applications has generally taken longer than anticipated. So as best as you can, try to plan for this and set time aside. And in the survey that we sent out to former TOPS recipients, we found that one of the most common responses for improving our program would have been a faster review process. And a large component of this is making sure that your small grants program team is staffed appropriately. So bringing on additional staff if needed to review applications can really be quite helpful. And also making sure that the panel of reviewers has the relevant expertise. So at the very least, your panel should include experts in the technical area that you're seeking to fund and also finance staff to review the budget. So finally, once you've assembled your panel of reviewers and collected the applications, allot your time appropriately. If you can make a schedule to indicate about how much time will be needed to review applications, that's one good practice. Will you meet as a panel? Will you review independently? These are also good considerations to think about before your program is, or before you've begun accepting applications. And then based on the criteria developed while drafting the request for proposals, you can create an evaluation sheet with a point-based rubric and a section for notes where you might include concerns or questions that require follow-up from the applicants. When evaluating proposals, it's easy to put a lot of value on how well written the application is, and sometimes this can indeed be an indicator of how successful the proposed activities might be. But a proposal that is not expertly written but presents a strong idea might also be worth exploring, as it could be that the organization just doesn't have the funds to hire a strong, dedicated grant writer, but they still have a cool idea worth investing in. And again, small grants are a good opportunity to consider these types of risks. And then just generally throughout the evaluation process, it's good to strive to be as transparent as possible with applicants. So if you're able to provide an anticipated timeline for review, you can share this with applicants. And it's a bit more time-intensive, but if human resources permit, good practice to keep applicants updated on the status of their application. And then the sooner you're able to communicate any decisions regarding funding, the sooner that organizations who've applied can plan accordingly. If it happens that you need to follow up with applicants regarding questions on their application or more information, make sure to make these conversations practical, straightforward, and non-committal. So respect your applicant's time and do your best to not make any promises that you might not be able to keep. I'll now turn it over to Clara to talk about best practices from the grantee perspective for preparing for and responding to a request for application.
Okay, hello everyone. I hope you can hear me. This is Clara. I work for Action Against Hunger and I'm based in Paris. This is actually my last day of work. I will soon be moving to the Netherlands Red Cross. And I work mostly in humanitarian innovation and research projects as a grant manager and a fundraising manager. So thank you, Laura, for the opportunity. I will be speaking a bit how to apply to a call for small grants. Many of the points I will mention will actually apply also when you are responding to a bigger grant. Another thing I want to mention is there are courses in proposal development and fundraising that can take anywhere from like a day or a couple of days or a week. So, and today we only have 50 minutes, so I will try to stick to what I feel, in my experience, are the main points. I sort of divided it into 3 parts. So basically what you need to do before, during, and a couple of points what you need to do after submission. So if we start with the before part, for me as a fundraising manager, it's really important to keep abreast of funding opportunities, you really need to know what's coming so that you can plan. There are websites that can help you, that give you alerts, things like funds for NGOs or DevEx or development aid, but also newsletters like the one from the TOPS, the FSN network. Personally, I'm also following most of the donors' Twitter accounts because they tend to also announce any funding opportunities there. And of course your personal relations you might have with any donors. If you're speaking to them in their offices or during conferences, they also might alert you like, hey, in a couple of months or next month we will release this or that call. So really planning is a key aspect. So know what's coming and know what you need. So really be clear on your funding needs. So specifically for small grants, within ACF, we tend to normally go for bigger grants, operational grants, big programs in the field, but still the small grants are important to us because they help us to get seed funding for new ideas, to do some pilots on some innovations. Sometimes it's a matter of co-funding certain projects. Like Laura mentioned, this particular TOPS grant helped us to disseminate learnings from one of our research projects. Anything around communication and uptake, or training, capacity building, or developing an e-learning course. This might require not a huge amount of funds, but still you need to recruit some staff for it. You might do some travel, you might do some printing, so these small grants really can come in handy. And like Laura mentioned, you might take a bit more of a risk with them. You won't take that kind of risk when you're applying for a multi-million grant, maybe with USAID, but the TOPS grant really could allow you to take some more risk and experiment. Another point, if you are doing it as part of a consortia, maybe that's less applicable for a small grant, but still you can do implement a small grants project also as part of a partnership. But this partnership building, especially if it's a new partner, really takes time. And if you just start looking for partners as soon as the call is out, and you may only have like a 4-week timeline to do it in, and you need to start talking about what is our approach, what do we want to achieve, how do we want to achieve it, how are we going to budget, there's too little time. So if you really are doing this as a consortium, start preferably before the call comes out, unless you know the partner already really well because you're doing another project and this maybe is a follow-up thing. Okay, then it's maybe a bit of another situation, but otherwise start early. Another thing I also want to mention is before the call comes out, you can sometimes pitch your idea to the donor to see what do they think. Do they think it matches well with the upcoming call or not? Is there anything we need to highlight? Some donors do not give you this kind of feedback or do not allow it, but some donors only will do it before the call comes out. So for this is really a key moment to do it, because as soon as the call is officially out, they are not always allowed to respond to these kind of questions. So use your time well before anything comes out, I would say. Then once the call is announced, it's on the website or it's on the newsletter. So day one, you need to be aware of this, so don't lose any time because response time is usually quite short. So 4 to 6 weeks is really not uncommon. It can even be shorter than that. So you, maybe I skipped to point 3, but you really need to start reading all the documents carefully. Many of my colleagues here, they sort of, the call comes out and there's this big tender documentation behind it, or small, and they sort of read the first paragraph and they go, oh, that's nice, let's do it. But you really need to read the fine print to make sure that all the conditions match well, because conditions such as eligibility, we are an international NGO, we are not eligible for all funds. Sometimes it's specifically for local civil society organizations, for example. What are the co-funding requirements? How are payments done? Is it payment by results? What kind of templates do you need to use? What are the dates for submitting, but also what are the dates for asking questions, because many donors usually also have a deadline for that, after which you can no longer ask any questions for clarification. Are you doing any information webinars? So really go through, have at least one person in your office who goes through all the tender documents. And then you can also decide together with your team if it really matches what you want to propose, and if it matches with your organizational strategy, with the outcomes you want to achieve, and your funding needs. So this really needs to come together. Then also look if it's like a one-stage or a two-stage submission, because normally if it's a one-stage submission, so you have to submit a full proposal straight away, that's a lot of work and a lot of effort and energy that goes into it, and you actually don't know how many others will submit. So for example, if you look at things like the grant challenges, there can be hundreds of applications. So if you put in a lot of effort, you know, you really need to know, or you really need to feel like you have a real chance of success. If it's a two-stage submission with a concept note pre-selection phase, we tend to take a bit more of a risk with that, because normally you only have to fill in a couple of pages, so it's quite, you can do it quite quickly. But yeah, that for me is a very important aspect as well. And know where to submit. Is it by email? Is it by mail in a hard copy? Or is it these online submission systems for which you might need to register? Also, these online submission things are normally very limited in how many characters you can input in each section. So you really need to formulate all the sections well. You really need to do that in advance, because if you try to do it 5 minutes before the deadline, then I'm sure, you know, the whole system will block, or you will have 2 characters too much, and then everything starts to panic. So don't do that. Check it very well beforehand. If I would go to my next slide, yeah, it works. Then developing your submission. So the call is out, you've read all the documents very well, you know the timeline. So now, usually in the first week, we have a proposal planning meeting. And then you really need to work backwards from the submission date and see, okay, what do we need to write, what do we need to develop, what kind of information do we need to collect, and how are we going to do this. So I normally make like a work plan or some kind of a table which assigns responsibilities to different people in the team and also sets clear deadlines for it, interim deadlines. And I usually also put in specific dates for sending around drafts, because what I saw happening is that people finally they have made the first draft and they send it around and please read it and give me comments by tomorrow, but then the rest of your team or your reviewers might not be available. So really stick to the deadline, say, okay, I'm going to send you a first draft at this date, please block some time in your agenda so you can read it and give me your comments afterwards. I mentioned this is really a teamwork. I know that some smaller organizations might not have the luxury of doing this as a team. But for me, to have a good proposal, to develop something, you really need 3 competencies. One being technical, so if it's a wash or food security or cash, or you need a technical expert who can really work on the needs analysis, on the results you want to achieve, the approach, the log frame or the theory of change. So that's one part, and it's the core part of the proposal, but it's not the only part, because the financial part, people sometimes tend to forget to do this well, or they just approach their financial officer a day before deadline. Oh, by the way, we need a nice budget for this. And no, for me it really goes together. So as soon as you have a first draft on your technical part, you really need to sit together with your financial officer and start costing all the activities and the staff you need. Really do it together. There should be no big surprises in your budget. Also for the donor, if you're writing your technical part, your financial part should be sort of self-explanatory. And they will use this also maybe to establish value for money. So be as clear as you can. Also be up to date on the conditions, what kind of costs are actually allowed and what's not allowed, what is the overhead rate that is allowed, what kind of cost categories you need to use. So these things take time. So really plan ahead with your financial officer. Then there is an administrative or compliance part. This really depends on the donor because, well, some ask very little and some donors, some US donors maybe specifically ask a lot of information to be added to your concept note and especially your proposal. So things like your overhead rate or your NICRA, but maybe also your code of conduct, some project references to demonstrate your ability to implement the project, CVs. If these things are required to submit and they are missing, your submission might be rejected, and that's really a pity because you put so much effort into the technical and maybe the financial part, and then it's rejected for a stupid reason. Some donors are nice, and then they give you like a heads up or a call and say, okay, there's this one document missing, can you please send it? Other donors are less nice, so then you really have to make sure that everything is there from the start. If I go to the next slide. Yeah, so if you start writing it, really think about who is the donor, who is your audience, and especially if your donor is a specialist in the subject or more of a generalist. Again, if you look at USA, if you write a WASH proposal, they have excellent WASH experts in the team, so you can use jargon and you don't have to go in too much explanation sometimes on what you're doing, but other donors might be much more generalist, and then you really should avoid using very specific jargon in your technical part. Also make sure that you're using the right terminology in the sense that it matches the donor's terminology, so they're not confused on what you mean, and be very clear and concise in your language. I work in France, and French people tend to make very long sentences that can be a paragraph long, and that makes it very hard to read and maybe less convincing. So think about your language, think about what you're proposing, and like Laura said before, the strong idea. The idea is the most important. That's what the whole proposal is based on. But you also do need to demonstrate your capacity to implement it. So it needs to be, you need to show that it's thought through. If it's not so well written, some donors again might be nicer than others, and they might say, okay, we really like the idea, but you need to resubmit the proposal and make some things more clear, or maybe you can resubmit next time. But basically be as clear and concise as you can. Be exciting and innovative. Yeah, you want to be awarded the grant, but also be very realistic in what you promise to do. Good implementation starts really with your proposal development, and that's something Beth later on will touch upon as well. But if you start with an unrealistic work plan or outcomes or budget, it will be very hard, and you might suffer from reputational damage with that specific donor. So yeah, like I said, be realistic. I remember, well, this is years ago, and it was with another organization I was working for, but one of the team members hired a proposal writer who wrote really well, really convincing, but in the end they found out that what he was proposing was really not realistic. It was for the budget and the timeline that we had. So, like I said, be realistic. When you develop your work plan, normally this is also asked as part of your proposal, then, like I said, good implementation starts at the development phase. So I normally recommend to build a bit of an inception phase. So you have like maybe the first month of your project, so you can review your narrative, the results and the activities, but also the budget, because there might be a long time between you submitting your proposal and being awarded the grant and being able to start. So you might need to revise and review. Things might have happened in between, either in the country where you work, either with your team. So an inception phase is always a good idea. Also make sure you plan and budget for meal activities, so monitoring evaluation. for your baselines and end lines you might need to do. And with my projects, we tend to be too optimistic in how quickly we can achieve our results. There are many things that can happen in between. Delays can happen, especially when you're working in fragile states. So don't be too optimistic in your work plan, and check also with the donor that you're submitting to if they might be willing to allow a no-cost extension or not. One of the last points is think about your visibility and your communication plan as part of the project. Check the donor requirements. Some donors are very specific in what you need to do in terms of visibility and the use of the logos and the disclaimers. And, but also use it as an opportunity, because donors really like visible projects, and I think sharing your results is anyway a good idea. So think as part of your project plan how you are going to engage with social media, what kind of photos and videos you can use, and budget for it as well. And then do a final check before you submit, because some of the grants program, they have a long list of all the things you need to do. You might maybe have forgotten some things you need, so really 2-3 days before, really go over it again and make sure you tick all the boxes that you need to tick. Yeah, so then you submit. Hooray, you submitted. I just made this point because usually you submit something and then there is a long waiting period and nothing tends to happen, and then people start again once the thing is awarded or not. Well, the or not, you might not be awarded the grant. Things, yeah, that happens. Usually there are more people responding to a request for applications than there is funds. So keep them in a central place and try to recycle them. We have been rejected for a number of grants, but we have also been able to use the same idea and part of the same text. Usually you do need to adapt it in some way, but and then got the grant with another donor. So keep them in a central place for your team, and also try to ask for feedback from the donor. Why were you not selected? Sometimes you just get a annoying answer like, there were just too many applications, but some donors do give you valuable feedback, because normally they have an evaluation committee with experts in it, so and they say, okay, this was not clear, or this did not match with the call. That helps you in your next submission. My last point would be consider what human resources will be required. The earlier point I mentioned that I see with the project we do that we might have delays. That can also be because from day one you need to have your team in place. So if you are awarded the grant and the project starts, you need to have the team in place. Sometimes you need to recruit additional people for your project. So, and that might take time. That might take maybe 2 weeks, but it also might take 3 months, and then you're starting with delays. So you need to hit the ground running. As soon as the donor indicates that you might be selected, there's usually a time before the award is really signed. Take that time to immediately put your vacancy out and start recruiting, so you don't start with delay, or ask the donor if you can start a little bit later to make sure that you have your team in place. So I think, Laura, that was my last slide. I don't know if anyone has any questions or that we should do it at the end of the webinar. Laura? Or I give...
maybe from Walter here seems quite relevant to what you just talked about, so maybe we can take a look at that quickly. So Walter is asking, do you recommend hiring consultants to write proposals, or would you just hire someone internally?
We do both. So we also, it's really looking at who's available to do it and their writing skills. So sometimes you have excellent technical specialists with the most innovative and brilliant ideas, but they're just not good writers. So then working together with a grant writer that you hire can be a good idea, but you need to supervise them really closely because they cannot propose anything that is not part of your organizational DNA. They need to know all the ins and outs of the way that you're working. So yes, you can hire a grant writer. Also, for if I'm looking at Francophone, organizations that respond to an English call, yes, it might be helpful to have an English writer as well. But yeah, supervising really work. It's really co-creation, and it's not like, hey, here, write a proposal for us, and then we'll see you back in like 3 weeks. No, that's really not a good practice.
Right, right. And as you're saying, with someone external, really important that you are getting them up to speed on all the technical stuff that they need to know and kind of the ins and outs of your own organization. So to some extent, it sounds like the responsibility is working with a wider team and really like kind of collecting all of those inputs to pull together something comprehensive in neat and compliance as well. Yeah. And as you mentioned also, maybe depends on not only whether they have the technical expertise, but whether or not they have the time, right? So I guess if everyone already is fully preoccupied with other work, then hiring a consultant, I think, in that situation could be helpful.
Yeah, to coordinate the process and to bring everything together. Sometimes we respond to multi-country calls, so it does help to have someone temporarily with an extra pair of hands and, you know, very good writing skills. But if nobody has time to work on a proposal, then don't submit, because people will still need to put in time into the development of the proposal, even if they're not, you know, fully writing the thing. They still need to be in meetings, and they need to help with the ideas and with the costings, and so.
Walter, does that answer your question? Any follow-up questions?
Okay.
Great. Thanks for that. All right. Well, thank you, Clara. That was great. So now I'm sort of returning here from the grant-making perspective. So at this point, you have reviewed all of your applications, and you've sort of made these final decisions about whether each proposal will receive funding for your small grants program or not. And as mentioned in my previous section, ideally you've been in touch with applicants to keep them loosely updated on the status of their applications throughout the review process. So they don't need to know necessarily every single step in your process or every conversation you've had around their application, but as much as you can keep them kind of aware generally of where their application stands in reviewing or when you're able to get back to them, that's helpful. So anyway, once your panel has made a decision about each application, you should disclose this information to both organizations whose proposals you've approved, but also those who you've rejected, right? It's not a good practice to keep them uninformed, wondering what the fate of their application was. So in my experience, even organizations who have had rejected applications have been appreciative of good communication. And though time and resources don't always easily permit this practice, grant makers should really strive to provide information about why a proposal was rejected. And again, you don't necessarily need to go into great detail with this, writing pages and pages of feedback, but this can really serve as important feedback for organizations to consider when they apply for a grant in the future. It's all about, as best as you can help build their capacity or have them avoid making similar mistakes in the future. That can be quite helpful. So for organizations that have successfully applied, you should congratulate them and then follow up with any important information around expectations. So for TOPS, after we made decisions about successful applications, we followed up with what was sort of this award package, we called it. So information as part of this package might include what deliverables are expected. This can be kind of as part of a more formal contract, what the payment or reimbursement terms might be. And this is actually also something to consider as you design your program. So if you're planning on potentially awarding grants to really small local organizations, perhaps you think about what their financial capabilities are. So will they be able to fund things upfront themselves and then you reimburse them, or perhaps you pay them before they begin implementing. you should also include information about who in your organization can be reached with any questions from the grantee. So at this point, you should provide really clear guidance around all expectations you have as a donor, and all the more so if these expectations were not something that were included in the RFA. If your organization requires narrative or financial reports, including these templates with the award package also will enable the organizations to be prepared with this information once it's time to complete and submit any reports, rather than emailing them a couple weeks before saying, here is the report that we require and all of the information that we're asking for. Could be that they haven't been collecting that information. So being upfront with all of your expectations from the very beginning, and being open to communicating with them with any types of questions via email, through a startup call, all of these can be really helpful practices. So the TOPS program provided technical experts to support each grant, and it was at this stage that our TOPS grant specialists connected relevant TOPS technical staff with staff from grantees organizations. And as you might recall from that Family Feud slide at the beginning, access to TOPS technical support was one of the aspects that was most valued by grantees about the TOPS Small Grants program. So this isn't something that you might see with all types of small grants program, but it was something that I think grant recipients appreciated, and also beneficial to the grant-making organization because involving staff from your program as technical experts can be beneficial in ensuring that the project awarded is remaining aligned with your small grant program's broader objectives. So depending on the number of grants awarded and the number of deliverables expected, managing a portfolio of small grants can be challenging. So one of the most important things is remaining organized. And to do so, you might consider creating a file for each grant. So these files can include things like formal paperwork, important correspondences via emails, changes to the work plan, notes about important conversations. So best to document these things as well as you can for several reasons, one of which being potential turnover, and the longer the implementation of the grant, the more opportunity to forget about conversations that happened months ago that might be relevant to keep in mind down the line. So you can also create trackers like the one shown here and use for our TOPS Small Grants program. As you can see, this tracker is a spreadsheet with basic information about the grant on the left, including the name of the project, the implementing organization, the start date, the end date, and the respective technical lead. So what we're looking at here was a spreadsheet that was used to track our micro grants, which were the $50,000 grants that were paid upon completion of a particular milestone. So these colored boxes here are where I've marked when each milestone was intended to be completed, and they're color-coded to show completion. So each milestone cell included a little note here that you'll see at the bottom of the screen that has information about what the milestone was and what amount corresponded to those deliverables. So having this tracker was really helpful. It allowed me to easily view everything in one place. I could easily see when milestones were upcoming, and that allowed me to send gentle reminders to grantees when necessary. And it was really sort of just a one-stop shop in a way, and prevented me from having to dig through paperwork to remind myself of when I was expecting to see what milestone and how much that we had allocated for a certain milestone. So really helpful to keep organized. As part of TOPS's mandate to encourage knowledge sharing amongst organizations, this is also something that we tried to encourage as we managed our portfolio of small grants. So in part we did this, as I mentioned at the beginning, by suggesting and prioritizing knowledge sharing criteria in our initial RFAs, and then sticking to that criteria as we evaluated grant applications. But they were also built into these milestones that I mentioned for many of our grants. So we would encourage a webinar or posting a resource on the FSN network or the organization's own internal network, trying to make sure that these lessons learned were shared across organizations. And throughout the implementation of our Top Small Grants program, we also strive to document our accomplishments and our shortcomings throughout. So we had multiple external reviews throughout the life of the program, and we sought to use these findings to improve our program throughout. It's also crucial for grant makers to recognize the importance of staying flexible. So if any of you are organizations who have implemented grants in the past, you'll appreciate the fact that the landscape is constantly shifting, and you might set out to do one thing and then you run into some hurdles along the way. So I think it's important for donors to appreciate this reality and try to execute due diligence as much as is possible, but also limit the burden for the implementing organization by keeping flexible, keeping in contact with the grantee, and really kind of working together as a team to work towards your common goal of seamless implementation. So yeah, maybe at this point I would invite each of you to think about donor restrictions that maybe have made implementation more challenging than you'd like for your organization in the past. And if there's anything that comes to mind, you can feel free to write a response in the chat box, and we can return to these questions later. But at this point, I'd like to introduce Beth from Medical Teams International to talk about best practices for preparing for implementation once a grant has been awarded.
Hello, can everyone hear me? I'm going to assume that you can hear me. Thank you so much, you guys. There's been so much great input already, and I just wanted to say that from a recipient perspective, it's really super important, what was just being said by Laura about the donor being organized, providing clear expectations, and having technical expertise available. And one other thing that was really helpful for us was the milestones, because it helped keep TOPS on track, but it also helps keep us on track and see our progress. So let's talk about some tips for implementing a small grant. Once you have received approval for your small grant, you will need to review grant documents. You might want to have a startup meeting with the donor to go over the details of the contract as well as any important deadlines. When my organization, Medical Teams, received a small grant from TOPS, we didn't actually do this. We're a very small organization, but maybe we should have. I just communicated separately with the financial staff, the program staff, and the country office team. We could have benefited from having a startup meeting so that we all could get more quickly on the same page. From the start, it's important to note key dates, narrative, and financial reporting requirements, including specific restrictions that the donor might have. Mark down when specific reports are due to the donor, like quarterly or monthly, which is generally required. Give yourself some extra leeway to make sure you have enough time to get the data you need, not only at the headquarter level, but also at the country office level. And for us, we were also dealing with requirements of our contractor. Beware of financial requirements such as budget versus actual, and document and review expenses regularly. Sometimes this goes without saying, but it really is important that you set up timelines for financial as well as narrative reports, allowing those responsible to generate the information that they need to get and have them submitted to you to review together if needed. In our case, we had reports from our Liberia country office as well as headquarters, so we had to make sure that they were synced each month. This is especially important when you have such a short time frame. Clarify the donor technology. Can you hear me okay? Am I not speaking loud enough? Let me turn up my, how's this? Is that better? I've turned up my microphone, so I hope that's helping. Clarify the donor technology. Okay, great. Clarify the donor technology. We had a designated advisor from TOPS who was available to answer any questions we had. This alleviated so many doubts. We had a lot of questions about certain words in the contract, like the word vendor. In our case, NTI was the vendor, but the film production company we contracted with, which we called the vendor, was called a contractor by the donor. However, once we clarified this with TOPS, we were fine. And of course, it's important to follow the rules. I would say that when it comes to reporting for U.S. government grants, there's really no space to be creative when you're responding to requirements. The rule of thumb is to make sure you are directly following the rules and answering the question that's there. When in doubt, ask. In our case, we found the top staff to be quite available. We even, at the end of our near final project, we showed them the cover page of our paper, and we wanted to share with them the different logos for them to quickly review to make sure we were following USAID's strict branding guidelines. And this really helped a lot with our stress level because, you want to get it right. You'll also need to do some things internally to get your own team organized. One suggestion is to assemble a grant management team, which might include an administrator, a program manager, and a finance manager. Hold a startup meeting to define roles and responsibilities. Since some time will have passed since you sent in the proposal, this meeting helps to refresh and crystallize what the project is setting out to do and who needs to do which tasks in order to reach your objectives. This is especially important when you have a small time frame. In our case, I also had to fight the perspective from our organization that the project was not important because it was a relatively small amount of money. And I think that those of you in larger organizations can relate to that. Determine who will be the focus person, the point person for the communication with the donor. This is not necessarily the same person who does the official submission of reports. In our case, we had a VP that had that role, while I was the person managing the tasks of the project, and therefore had more correspondence with the donor advisor at TOPS. After it is signed, make sure you visit the contract regularly. This helps to remind you of donor requirements while you are steeped in following your work plan. Even a quick review once per quarter can help you to make sure you are staying accountable to the grant requirements. So you see here on the screen, I've shared a copy of one of the required forms that we had to complete with kind of an itemization of all the different meetings and presentations, which the donor called events, and the number of participants and the date of each meeting. This was required for all of our meetings in headquarters as well as in the field. So now I'm going to move to the next slide. See if there's any comments here. Okay. So as you start to implement, have a clear work plan and use a shared calendar to track important dates. Things like reporting deadlines, calls with the donor, etc. Set reminders so that you don't forget your deadlines. Update and revise the timelines and get approvals as needed. So you see here on the right side of the screen a copy of NTI's project timeline, which we had to revise 1 month after we received the grant. We did our best to be as realistic as possible, and we pretty much kept to those dates. Each time we made a change, though, we had to resubmit it to the donor, so we tried to minimize the changes. Our added incentive was that our payment was linked to achieving specific grant milestones, so we really pushed ourselves to complete those in a timely fashion. It's also important to review progress on finances as well as program activities. Try to stay on target with your spending. This will happen if you continue to have regular check-in meetings with your own internal grant management team. Okay, now I'm moving on to the next slide. During project implementation, it's important to keep up communication with the donor to assure them that you are on track, because some time can go by without much communication at all. But you can do most of this through email updates. Be transparent. Keep in mind that by giving you the grant, donors have invested in you. They want you to succeed. If you realize during the course of implementation that some changes are needed to your program plan, discuss the changes together with your grant management team, what is possible and what's not possible within the donor's conditions. Then share this with the donor. We have found them to be reasonable. They will also be appreciative that you share this issue with them. Document the discussion. On both sides, there might be turnover, and so this is important that you have something in writing so that you know what's been discussed. And this actually happened with us. Our VP level staff person changed, and the TOPS advisor changed as well. During the staff transition, we copied both people and resent the grant documents to the new staff people. Communicate clearly with project staff so that they understand donor requirements and any changes needed, whether you're talking about financial or program. One example we had that we assumed that the calculation for NICRA in the field would be the same for headquarters, but in our case it wasn't. So we had to go back and work out internally what the rate would be and how it would be calculated. And overhead is different for each donor, and so we can't assume that everyone will know what the donor's rates are. It's also important to practice timely and thorough reporting. To do that, you will need to demonstrate results. When you prepare your quarterly and final reports, make sure you answer the questions directly. I can't emphasize this enough. This is a tough one, since small grants are usually completed within a few months or a year, so you sort of have to hit the ground running and do what you said you were going to do, including measuring the results. With very small grants, measuring results may consist of process indicators, such as whether the participants were trained, or whether the workshop or the manual was completed. With a longer period of time, sometimes you can get into measuring impact. When you are reporting, look directly at the question and answer it directly. Maintain good records and files of your activities. We ended up having our own folders for copying of project documents, rather than keeping final versions in a shared folder, but the information was there. Most of the time, if you did good planning, you will already be gathering the data you need to be able to document whether the planned activities took place, whether you trained all the participants you planned to train, etc. It's better to over-document than under-document and fall short later. This means that for every activity, you have to do this. And in our case, every community meeting, every webinar, and every presentation we did after we developed our video. After our grant was completed, TOPS actually asked us to provide more data on each meeting, the location, the name and organization of all participants, and their emails, if possible. So even though we weren't actually required to have this level of detail, we were asked for it later when they were doing their own due diligence. So I would advise that you err on the side of documenting all your activities. Donors often appreciate or require photos. They tell a story. These two photos from medical teams' video launching events illustrate the high-level engagement from partner organizations and their interest in receiving documents that we prepared about the project. Yes, mistakes do happen, more than we like to admit. They may cause headache in the moment, but they create windows of opportunity. MTR's project focused on Liberia, but because we were using the methodology also in Haiti, we decided to have a launch of the Liberia video in Haiti as well. However, we did not budget for the translation of the project materials into French or Creole, so we managed this by readjusting our budgets in order to translate the two most important documents. When the video was shown, our Haitian staff provided a verbal translation of the video, and it all turned out to be satisfactory in the end. But I wish we had considered this beforehand. So that was our reflect and reevaluation moment. So reflection and evaluation is important, and also hindsight is 2020. I would say in all, medical teams put its best foot forward in terms of collaboration and focus to be able to achieve the deliverables of our small grant within a short time frame. And also I want to say that donors do understand and they want to learn from your experience. Donors don't need to know all of the details. However, it's important for them to know the significant difficulties and learn so that they can take these challenges into account with their own grant requirements. For USAID, I don't think they will be simplifying their grant requirements anytime soon. But I was really pleased at the way that Save the Children was responsive to our needs and realities during the project implementation. So now I have a question for all of you participants. What best practices have your organizations used when implementing a small grant, and why would you consider it a best practice? So just think for a couple minutes about something that works really well, and if you can think of something, then just write it in the chat box.
And maybe as you're all kind of pondering this question, I can go back a little bit and touch on some of the comments that have been made throughout. So Beth had this question at the beginning. Some larger RFAs have a time period for questions about the grant, but I don't believe small grants have that mechanism. Have you seen that? And I think this question was more geared towards Clara. So Clara, feel free to jump in or share your thoughts. But I guess my 2 cents would be, depending on the size of the grant. As I mentioned, larger grants, there's often a desire to have a bit more due diligence, maybe be a bit more thorough in your review of applications. You might build in a concept note period to have like sort of a first look at applications and what types of applications you're receiving. So I think maybe the larger the grant, the more likely you would try to build into your program a period for questions about the grant. And as Dasha responded, we did do this for our larger small grants, the Program Improvement Awards, which were $100,000. We didn't do it for our micro grants, which were $50,000. But even if you don't build in a period for questions about the grant, there are, I think, other things you can do to sort of, even if you don't have a formal period where you're accepting grant questions, you might consider hosting a webinar to kind of pitch your small grants program. And at that point, you might get participants who are coming into the webinar with specific questions. So that would sort of be maybe a more informal way to troubleshoot some of these issues that potential applicants are thinking about. You might also just include, as I mentioned, on the request for applications, a contact person. And that way there's an opportunity for people with questions to get in touch with someone from the grant-making organization. And then I think to Clara's point, if you're keeping a close connection with the donor even before a request for applications is dropped, then perhaps you've already had some of these questions answered. So, maybe you've already had several conversations and you've kind of pitched your idea in one way or another. You understand their priorities, they understand your priorities, and that way you've picked each other's brain, and then when there's an opportunity to submit an application, you sort of already have a good idea of how you can be framing your ideas so that they're relevant to the donor or that they're applicable.
Yeah, maybe I can add to that. We, as ACF, we also run a small grants program ourselves. For me, it's also, if people have questions during the submission process, you have need to think beforehand how you answer them. So we have a general email address so people can post questions. Are you just responding to that one person who is sending the question, or are you collecting all the questions, maybe until a certain deadline or not until a certain deadline, and then making them visible to everybody who might respond? So are you doing it like one-on-one, or is it more of a, like you want to have everybody to have the same information? So for me, that's what matters. The other question, if there's, with grant programs, small grant programs, if you have a rolling deadline, I think that really depends upon the organization. With our small grant program at ACF, the evaluation is done by an external selection committee. It's a research and innovation foundation, so these are scientists and what have you, and they only meet once a year. So then you have a very clear deadline to work towards. But yeah, that's really, I know there are many small grants who have, well, not many, but there are some that really have on a rolling basis they accept concept notes. So yeah.
And I think one benefit of collecting and reviewing all applications at once, so I guess to say not have a rolling deadline, but have sort of a hard deadline where you're reviewing all of the applications within one time frame and awarding them all more or less around the same time, is that perhaps you can more objectively compare them and also make connections. So you can kind of make your grant making perhaps a bit more holistic, because you're reviewing everything at the same time, you're able to see the connections, you might be able to put organizations with proposing similar work in similar geographic areas in touch, or perhaps you have, you want to make an award to a small organization, but you're a little bit concerned about capacity, for example, and then there's a larger organization that is proposing similar work. You might connect them and see how they can work together to mutually benefit each other. So I think you're able to draw those connections a bit better if you're reviewing all the applications at the same time. So that would be, I don't know, a couple arguments in favor of having a harder deadline. But then in a situation where you're trying to really get money out the door quickly, so I mentioned that I had spent some time in Puerto Rico starting up a small grants program. So in that situation, obviously you're not going to wait around for months to collect every application you can and then review them against each other. There's a bit more of a sense of urgency there. So I would say in more of like a humanitarian emergency type situation, rolling is probably the way to go, understanding that you're perhaps not going to be able to compare all of these applications against each other, but the benefit of getting money out the door quickly sort of outweighs that cost, perhaps. Any other questions? And then when I had posed the question, what are some types of restrictions that you all have perhaps run into during implementation that has made carrying out your projects more difficult? Clara responded, for me, important donor restrictions are if they're not flexible in shifting between budget lines or in allowing a bit more time at the end, so no cost extension. And as I mentioned, TOPS had two different types of small grants. And so the type Clara's organization received was this $100,000 grant, and that required submitting a financial report with different budget line items, and we reviewed that a bit more thoroughly. And then for micro grants, there were no financial reports required. Those were, as I mentioned, those payments were made depending on completion of a certain milestone, and that amount was set before. So we called that a fixed amount award. And those awards were, I think, really beneficial in that the grantee organization wasn't having to take too much time to compile any type of financial report. It was less burdensome for us also as the grant-making organization, and that didn't take, there were no types of financial reports to review. So that is one benefit of the smaller fixed amount awards and sort of the strings that were attached to that. So, and that's something that we could have considered for our larger program improvement awards as well. So it's all about, I think, trying to strike that balance of doing your due diligence as the donor and also keeping flexible. And so a lot of that depends on the comfort level of your organization in making grants, maybe the level of funds that you have to make grants, and then also more contextual things like whether or not you're operating in a fragile environment or in an emergency context in which you don't want to be making your grantee's life any harder than maybe it already is, for example. So those are my 2 cents. And then Beth had mentioned in the chat box general USAID restrictions. So that's a consideration as well. TOPS was carrying out our small grants program within the wider context of our TOPS program. So USAID was also quite involved in, starting us and helping us consider what our compliance requirements would be, what our reporting requirements were. So to some extent, we were beholden to them because our requirements needed to also be aligned with USAID's requirements, which were perhaps more stringent than ours would have been otherwise. Question from Julia, I see. Laura, you mentioned that having an RFA that was more targeted may be useful, for example, the Warehouse Staff Safety Guide. After dealing with the small grants both in Puerto Rico and with TOPS, are there any other changes that you would make to the process? A good question. No, great question. Thanks for asking. So I guess just generally speaking, I think for an organization the size of Save the Children and the types of organizations that we were giving grants to, I mentioned oftentimes these were larger U.S.-based foundations like World Vision, Project Concern International, Action Against Hunger. So these are well-founded organizations with lots of experience implementing grants. So I think perhaps some of the requirements that we had and some of the oversight that we required, as both Beth and Clara have mentioned, this shifting between budget lines, not being as flexible as perhaps would have been ideal in financial reporting and no-cost extensions. I think those are things that could have been improved. The organizations we made grants to already were very experienced in implementing, and I think it would have just made their lives a bit easier if we allowed these types of changes a bit more flexibly. And then in addition to that, I think I also mentioned that really I think the benefit of a small grants program is that you're able to take risks that you wouldn't be able to otherwise with a larger grants program. So I think as best as you can take, somewhat reasonable risks, and this will also vary by organization depending on how risk averse you are and how many internal compliance requirements you have, and whether or not you're reporting to a larger donor and what their requirements are. So it can vary based on all this criteria, but as much as you're able to take these risks within reason to kind of really keep things moving forward and open the door to new types of ideas and projects, build the capacity of local organizations who are on the ground doing this work. I think that can be really beneficial. But a lot of this, yeah, depends on your organization, what you're trying to achieve with your small grants program, what the size of the awards are. So there's really quite a few factors. I hope that helps. Great. All right. Super. So we have a couple minutes left, and you can now, I think, see the. Can you guys see the results from the polls? I see their names. Great. Okay, so you can take a couple minutes to go over these questions. So the first question here is true or false? It's okay to apply for a grant even if your organization's mission and strategic goals do not fit within the objective of the grant program. Oh, and it looks like we were pretty clearly divided on this. 50-50. So the answer to this one is false. You should really not be chasing funds just for the sake of getting more funding. And as Clara mentioned, it's probably not a good use of your organization's time to be pursuing a grant that isn't aligned with your goals. Oftentimes, also, the donor will be able to see through that. Second question, when putting together a proposal, it's acceptable to have...
Maybe Laura, can you just add? I do see why people are a bit divided on it. I think, Beth, we were talking about this earlier, and you also mentioned like your organization is known for its medical work, although you were still able to get the TOPS grants, which is more food security, because in the wider scope of things that you do actually do quite a lot of food security activities. So it shouldn't be, maybe food security is not in your prime organizational mission, but you do have a capacity and an experience in doing this kind of thing. So that's what you then need to bring forward when you're applying to this grant again. If it's completely out of your scope, yeah, then you will not. I would not recommend doing that. But it's also the way of how you present it and what you have experience in, I think.
Right.
I agree with that. Thank you for bringing that up, Clara. In our case, we wouldn't say that we are a food security organization per se, but we do work in food insecure environments and could be potentially a food recipient in the future, who knows, right? And so what we had to bring to the table really was relevant for the donor. So in our case, it really did align well.
Yes, a good clarification, right. So if it's not absolutely perfectly aligned, that's not necessarily an indicator that you absolutely shouldn't go for it, but you shouldn't really be, I guess, trying to make a fit where there isn't one naturally. So thank you for that clarification. Moving on to the second question, when putting together a proposal, it's acceptable to have significant items in the budget that are not substantiated in the narrative. And you all answered this 100% correctly. The answer to this is false. As a grantor reviewing applications, if we are seeing all types of budget items that haven't been mentioned in the narrative, that's going to be, at the very least, a question worth following up on. Question number 3 is, if a proposal is poorly written but presents a strong idea, you should still reject it. This is false as well, and you all answered this 100% correctly. I sort of thought that maybe this was going to be a tricky question, but I guess not. Smart audience here today. If I mentioned this during, I think, one of my first slides, so it could be that your organization just doesn't have someone who is super skilled in writing grants, but you still have a really strong idea and are going to be able to carry out the idea effectively. So it could be that the donor might follow up with some extra questions that weren't clear based on the writing, but it's not necessarily a reason to flat out reject. And then finally, the last question here is, which of the following practices should you strive for when evaluating proposals? Select all that apply. The first option is keep the applicant updated on the status of their application. This is indeed true, as you all mentioned. It's good to be as transparent as possible and not keep the applicant in the dark about where their application stands. B, evaluate each application based on its own set of criteria. Again, correct here, you don't want to do this. You want to have one standard set of criteria evaluation so that each application is being reviewed fairly and objectively. C, refrain from explaining rejections and providing feedback for future improvements. This is also false. You wouldn't maybe necessarily want to write pages and pages, as I mentioned, but if you can help organizations be better prepared to respond for a request for applications in the future, that's something that's appreciated. And then finally, D, anticipate human resources and plan accordingly. This is important, yeah, both for grantors and grantees. You want to think about how much time it will take for you to review applications, how much time it will take to manage the program once it's up and running, including all the administrative and compliance requirements, reviewing reports, including technical support if possible. So all of these require human resources, and it's good to plan ahead as best as you can. So that's all from me. Thank you all so much for joining today. We hope you learned something new about small grants.
Thanks to everyone. This was really fun to do this, and I hope everyone enjoyed and learned some things. And thank you for organizing this. Thank you to Laura and Adrian and Clara for making this happen. Thank you.
Yes, and of course, Beth and Clara, thank you to you as well. It's been fun. Thanks, everyone.